Hi, today we are in San Francisco with Dave from Technorati. Dave, who are you and what do you do?
My name is David Sifry, and I'm the founder and have done a bunch of different jobs over at Technorati.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the business model? So, how was the old business model of Technorati? How is the new business model of Technorati working? And why did you pivot?
It's a great question. So we experimented for quite a while. I would say that the naive business model was, gee, it's search. We'll put a bunch of ads on there. We'll sell ads like Google AdWords, and we'll make tons of money, right? And what was interesting about that, and we did do that for a while, but we never found that people were clicking strongly on the ads, is that Technorati was a very different kind of beast than Google was,
right,
or the Yahoo, or Ink2Me, or AltaVista. Mm-hmm. That people were not using Technorati as sort of the big librarian. And sometimes you want to find out about the news, and sometimes you want to find out about a product, and sometimes you want to find out about a place. Right, so all of those things could have some kind of an advertisement next to it, right. But things around products or places, like that's really lucrative. Mm. If you just want to find out what's going on right now, it's not quite right. as interesting. And what we realized was that because we were focusing so much on the internet as this enormous conversation, as opposed to the internet as this huge library, right? That the people who were really interested in the conversation were coming to us, and they were addicted. They were using it all the time, as long as the service was running. We had some technical challenges along that front too. But that the advertising model of just selling product ads wasn't going to work. Okay, so then what we realized was that what we really were building was relationships with people who were creators. Mm-hmm. That the people who actually were coming to Technorati all the time were people who were bloggers, who were reporters, who were people interested in what's going on in the conversation around the world. Mm-hmm. And very often they were also people who were creating that conversation as well. Mm-hmm. And so at that point we realized, what if we could be a conduit to help them make money? Mm-hmm. And that was when that first business model really took off. When we realized that, classically you would call that an advertising network, mm-hmm. right? We were doing a lot more than just ad network stuff, but even at its simplest, we were trying to help these publishers be able to not only learn more about who they were and where they sat in the top 100 or what have you, but also how they could make money off of what they were doing. And we did it in a very automated way. So that went very, very well for a while. What happened was, so that was sort of the first pivot. And then what happened there was that as programmatic, the whole world of advertising, internet advertising has changed over the last 5 to 6 years. Just enormously. Now, I stepped away from Technorati from an active role in 2008, but I've been sitting on the board ever since, the first day. And so it's been wonderful really to kind of just watch as how the older model of direct advertising and, building display ads and stuff like that model was really fading on everything except for the biggest of sites. But that there was still an enormous opportunity around this growing programmatic trend. Mm-hmm. And because we had so many deep relationships both with these publishers and with the demand sources, we were able to see a lot in the marketplace that wasn't being seen by other people. And so that then caused us to really go into a new technology world where it was less about search and now it was more about helping demand find supply and helping supply find demand. And that's much less of a public, woohoo kind of, make the world's, World Economic Forum kind of headlines, but it's actually a really, really strong, stable business. And so we've been doing that now for a while, and that has just been taking off like crazy. And so it's been really exciting to be a part of, you think the company is going to be one thing when you're starting it and you're running it, and it is that for some time. And then you realize, but in order for it to be sustainable, you really have to go where, the revenue is.
Right.
And, and transitioning your team, transitioning your company without changing the core values that you believe in. And that's one of those things that I feel just incredibly proud about. That, it's a business that looks very different today than it did in 2004 and 2005.
Yeah.
But I feel very comfortable that the way that we do business, the kinds of people who work there, and the kind of service that we're providing still fits those values very, very deeply.
Great. Dave, we always try to share some advice, and you already shared some of your lessons. Are there any other lessons you would like to share with our readers?
Good question. Boy, there's so many things that we could be talking about. So I think one of the things that I've always found really interesting is organizational development. And I think that startups, whether it's even inside of a bigger company or if it's a brand new startup, that there are some real challenges that happen. And having now built 6 companies, and some of them have gotten, 500 people or so. Some of them were still really small when we sold them. But, I've learned a few things about people and organizations. So I'll share a little bit about some of the things that I've learned. Maybe this will apply to you, maybe it won't. I don't know. So the single biggest thing to be looking for is communications cost compared to revenue, or shall we just say efficiency and in overhead, right? That every single new person that you add, right, there's going to be some reduction or some increase in communications overhead, right? Like the first one is literally when you go from it's just me and I'm just transferring between the two sides of my brain to now there's another person, we need to talk to each other, right? That's a huge amount of communications overhead, but you get nearly a doubling in productivity, right? So it's really worth it. When you go from 2 to 3, you're actually not that much more communications cost, but you're getting another, increase by 66% in your productivity. And that tends to work until you get to somewhere around 8 or 10 people. And there's this really obvious, very, very natural place where it's super highly efficient. You don't really need a lot of meetings. Everybody just sort of works together. It's very, very tightly coupled. And yet productivity is still significantly increasing for every single new person that you add. Then you start to switch. There's a phase that happens somewhere between like 8 to 10 people and about 18 to 20 people. Where you have to start using some kind of departmentalization, right? So you need to start saying, well, I'm going to focus a little bit more on engineering, you're going to focus a little bit more on marketing, you're going to focus more on sales, and you start to see these organizational elements pop up. But by no means is it formal yet, right? Like it's still, maybe you got the marketing guy, right? But everybody talks to everybody, you all in a big office space like this. But what you notice is that a couple of decisions made just by 2 guys having pizza late at night could have repercussions on the rest of the company, and so now there's a communications overhead that has to happen. So now you have to start having all hands meetings, and you have to let me bring you in on what the other parts of the company are doing, and you want to have cross-departmental or sort of executive staff meetings, these kinds of things. So these are what you want to watch out for, and then. Here's the most interesting part. So when you get from somewhere around 20 people up to about 60 is what I call the death zone.
Okay.
So what happens is, as soon as you start getting somewhere in the realm of the early 20s, the overall productivity of a new employee is actually offset by the communications overhead. So even though you get some small increase, there's so much more communications overhead in general that it actually costs you more money to bring in that employee. So this is the classic mistake that a lot of young startups, and I know I've personally made, is you're sort of at that 16 stage and you're like, we can just do one thing, but we can do it really well. We need to do 2 things. Let me hire 5 or 6 more people and we'll get that second thing done. Never happens. Never happens. What happens is you hire those 5 or 6 more people and it just adds more chaos. So, at that point, like this is actually where having a really good CFO or having somebody who is like a really good finance person, maybe that's you, the CEO, but like where you really need to sit down and say, do I have enough revenues? Like this new person that I'm bringing in, employee number 22, like what's the revenue impact that I'm going to get from this person? If it's more than their annual salary, hire them. If it's not, don't hire them, and you got to wait until you have enough of what you're doing to be able to grow. And that's the only way that I found to get through that death zone. So you just and it's just a slog, like every single new employee has to be justified by the additional amount of revenue that you're bringing in. And then, you're literally paying for them. Now, once you get to 60, another magical thing happens, which is all of a sudden you can start doing 3 or 4 things at once. You have a layer of middle management and process that just naturally falls into place. And now all of a sudden you get super efficient again. So from 60 to about 120, golden zone, right? Like you're doing great because you're making enough money, your revenues are growing, they're predictable. You can start going back and saying to, that's actually where the spreadsheets really, really matter.
Okay.
Right? Like when you're at 15 or 20 people and you don't know what your revenue model is, really, you kind of sort of do, but you're not sure. All those yearly projections, they're all BS.
Sure.
When you get to 60, and you're like, now you can start to forecast out a quarter or 2 quarters out, and you're like, wow, now I understand how to do some planning. And that's a fabulous time to be able to grow into new markets or grow, like expand internationally. Now, there's this next thing that happens at 120. So 120 is the Dunbar number. Have you ever heard of the Dunbar number?
Never.
So there was a scientist, and his first name slips my mind at the moment, but he basically he was an anthropologist studying tribes, and what he found was that when tribes get to be about 120 people, there's something in the human brain, we've sort of found this out, that actually you start believing that some of those people are no longer in your tribe.
Yeah, so they split somehow.
Exactly, and so they actually start to have civil wars. They start to, they'll naturally start to split. They'll have this, dichotomy. And so, in fact, like places like 3M, Good to Great, Jim Collins wrote about this, where, what 3M actually does is, like, as soon as you get to somewhere around 100, 110 people, is they literally split the department into 2 60-person departments.
Okay.
Where again, they're now at the golden size again, and now they each do separate things. Okay. And that, that's another one of those where, like, I remember at Linux Care when we had grown beyond the 120 people, and I remember, like, I was the co-founder of the company, and I remember walking down our halls one day, and people were like, "Hey, Dave, how you doing?" And I remember looking at my co-founder, I'm like, "Who is that?"
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, oh my God, they work here, clearly, they have a badge, it says Linux Care, and I don't even know, I've never seen them before, I don't know who they work for, I don't know how they got hired.
Yeah.
It's freaky.
Yeah, sure.
And so, so you want to avoid that. Like, so when you get to 120 is the time organizationally to start looking and saying, okay, how do we now split this up into really semi-autonomous or autonomous sub-organizations as well? So, that would be my short little treatise on organizational theory. Just some things I've learned in the field.
Dave, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts and your sharing of knowledge.
Sure, Martin. It's great to meet you, and thanks so much for coming.
Thanks.